I want to thank everybody for coming. My name is Alex Elson. I'm a senior counsel at the National Student Legal Defense Network, and I just want to say that I am just deeply honored and incredibly excited by all the energy and all the people who are in this room and who are here today to support us and to support this amazing film. This is going to be a fantastic event. So thank you all for coming and for being here. Before we get started, it's my distinct honor to introduce you to a very special guest who is going to say a few words before the film. As most of you know, Randy Weingarten is president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers. Under Randy's leadership, AFT has been at the forefront in the fight to make sure that higher education is about expanding opportunities for middle and lower class families and not, as Randy has said, a death sentence. So without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Randy Weingarten.
So this is a beautiful room, and you think about Carnegie and what the Carnegie Foundation is about and what they tried to do years and years ago in terms of the focus on education. And I often think that when we thought that high school was absolutely imperative in the United States of America, we found a way to finance it through a tax system. Now, is it equitable? No. Do we need to do more to make it equitable? Yes. I'm glad that John King is here, and he and I have worked on these issues for years, Wade Henderson, others. But think about what has happened in terms of higher education. And this film, in some ways, points out to some of the worst abuses. But in general, think about this. We say to kids, you need more than a post-secondary or a high school education, and yet we do not fund it. And so ultimately, kids who went to Corinthian, kids who went to IT&T, even kids who go to state universities, they do have a death sentence. Corinthian, ITT&T, they didn't even get a diploma worth the piece of paper it was written on. But we need to be the evangelists, not just the people in this room who just graduated from college. We need to be the evangelists for students in this country to say that $1.5 trillion of student debt is not what America is about. America is about making sure there's a ladder of opportunity. And that is what our union is dedicated to do. And this year, our focus is on how we do everything in our power to abate, mitigate student debt, and call out the bad actors. Not just simply say to people like the Betsy DeVosses and others, no, you can't make the Department of Education the Predatory Loan Association of America. You can't do that. Yes, that's important for us to do, but we have to be about the ways in which to actually say to a young adult who just becomes a teacher, who just becomes a nurse, who just becomes an engineer, you have the right in America to actually not have that as a death sentence. That is our obligation and responsibility to you, and that's why I am here, and that's why I'm glad to be part of this screening. And I want to one more time end by just saying thank you, National Student Legal Defense Network. Yes, I know many of you might still wish you were at the Department of Education, but we are really glad you are out there fighting the fight in the courts to help get justice. Thank you very much.
First, Randy, thank you so much
for coming. It's a great honor for us to work with AFT and with teachers across the country. So again, thank you so much for being here tonight. What a crowd. You know, I really want to thank everyone who came out tonight. It means so much to us in our first year, just starting out. Thank you again for your support, for building out this event, for coming out, for seeing the film. Just, you know, from a personal perspective, it means so much to see everyone here. For those of you who I haven't met, my name's Aaron Ammon. I'm the president of the National Student Legal Defense Network. And it's hard to believe it's been less than a year since we launched NSLDN. Through many conversations with folks who are here tonight and worked with us during the Obama administration, both at the Department of Education and other agencies, we had several conversations, you know, following the elections, and so many of us were troubled with the direction of higher education policy in this country, particularly where it was going under Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos, especially on the issues of predatory student lending, for-profit college abuse, and consumer protection issues. We sat around and said, what can we do about it? So we started a new organization that works through litigation and advocacy to protect many of the students who are at these schools or institutions that preyed upon them. We've worked to hold the Department of Education and Betsy DeVos accountable when they rolled back many of the policies that were enacted over the past several years to protect students at these schools. And since launching NSLDN just a few months ago, we've had some incredible success. I think it was 3 weeks out of the gate in the Southern District of New York in federal court, through some masterful arguments by Alex Elson, our senior counsel here, we obtained the first ever restraining order against Secretary DeVos. And forced the Trump administration to slow down their efforts to reinstate the largest accreditor of for-profit colleges, ACICS. We've worked to spearhead legislative and regulatory proposals at the state and local level. And just a few months ago, one of those proposals became law in the state of Maryland after our Vice President, Dan Zibel, went to testify before the House of Delegates and the State Senate on the legislation that he worked to draft with Delegate Shelley Heddleman and Senator Pinsky. It is now the law in Maryland that for-profit schools are required to provide enhanced disclosures to prospective students, and they've strengthened the tuition recovery fund for students at schools that closed down. But tonight, you know, this event is not about our organization, but we really want to focus on the students that we work and represent. And that's why a few months ago I was so fortunate to meet Alex Shebanow, who's here tonight and is the director of Fail State. And along with Dan Rather and their team, they've done a masterful job in putting together a film that really tells the stories of so many of students who attended these schools. And I think it's really important, especially here in Washington, when we often get lost in regulatory and legislative debates, in discrete policy issues, and we forget about whose lives are really affected by these issues. I'm also excited to announce here tonight that we will be filing a major challenge tomorrow morning against Betsy DeVos, thanks to our counsel Robin Bittner here, under the Data Quality Act to challenge her efforts to roll back the gainful employment regulations that were enacted to ensure that students attending for-profit and career programs earn enough money to pay back the debt that they incur. So before I introduce the film, I know there are too many people here that I want to thank, but I definitely want to introduce and thank first our team at NSLDN. Many of you know them already, but first I'll ask them to stand and say a few words. Dan Zibel, our vice president, Dan was the acting head, I think, over the last year of the higher education division in the council's office. He had to suffer through a year of running that organization with Betsy DeVos's team, but we were fortunate enough to recruit him away, along with Alex Elson, who spent that past year in federal student aid in the bar defense team. Robin Bittner, who I just mentioned, has joined us as well and is leading our efforts with this new challenge under the gainful employment regulations. And finally, Martha Fulford, who we were able to steal away as senior counsel at the CFPB to join us. And we didn't mention earlier, but Martha is our lead counsel on a major challenge we filed in the last few weeks on behalf of teachers across the country, challenging Betsy DeVos's illegal delay of the state authorization regulations that were enacted to protect students across the country in online programs. And we are extremely optimistic at our chances with Martha and Dan arguing against the Trump administration. So thanks to our team here who really make it happen. I want to take one quick minute and thank our board members and our advisory board members, many of whom are here tonight, but Saba Beretta, John Robinson, and Jacek Pruski, who are our founding board members. Thank you so much for all your help. There are a few folks who I'm eternally grateful for, not just for mentoring us while we served at the Department of Education, but for enacting many of the policies that we're now working to protect. Ted Mitchell, who was the undersecretary and is the president of the American Council of Education, is here tonight, along with James Cole, who was our general counsel and deputy secretary, who couldn't make it. We have two former deputy undersecretaries here, Bob Shireman, who first developed many of the proposals that we are now suing over to protect, and Jamie Studley, who's now president of the Western States Accreditor, is here. Finally, Fred Marinucci and Harold Jenkins, who for several decades led the Division of Post-Secondary Education at the Department of Education's counsel's office, are both here, along with Renee Brooker, who led the division at the Department of Justice that we worked with under the False Claims Act on so many cases. And Rob Kay, who was our chief enforcement officer at Federal Student Aid, is here tonight, along with Jay Urwitz, who is our deputy counsel for the last several years of the Obama administration. Finally, I'd like to thank our benefactors, the Kresge and Joyce Foundation, for underwriting this event and so much of our work. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank the team here at Carnegie and Amanda Fulton for planning this great event. But lastly, I'd like to thank my beautiful wife, Allison, for sacrificing our wedding anniversary tonight so we could have this event. But finally, I just want to say a couple more words about the film, because as I'm going around and making pitches and speaking to students and reporters, it's just so hard to get lost in the conversation here in Washington. When we're talking in legal terms, when we're in court explaining our lawsuits or explaining policy proposals, this film is so important that you see the people who are really affected. So thank you so much, Alex, for teaming up with us. We're really excited to host the Washington premiere of Fail State, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Good evening. My name is Dan Zibel. I'm the Chief Counsel and Vice President of NSLDN. Thank you all for being here and for watching this wonderful film tonight. Thank you for your support. I'm going to say a few words, but otherwise keep my remarks fairly brief so we can move on to this wonderful panel. I think what failed state crystallizes for so many people is that there truly is a crisis in higher education. Costs are rising, debt is rising, the drain on the American economy is increasing. But among the many issues that plague higher education, NSLDN believes that we have a duty to protect vulnerable populations. People like those who you just saw in this film. That's why NSLDN was created, that's why we're here, and that's why we're doing the work that we do every day. People are sold hope. They're sold the belief that college degree is an automatic economic leg up, and far too many, as we saw in the film, are sold a piece of paper that isn't worth the cost of the page it's printed on. They're sold hope and they're left drowning in debt. So every day NSLDN is fighting back against an administration that seems to be bending over backwards to protect schools and not students, to protect corporate profits and to leave students footing the bill. So that's why NSLDN, we are using courts and other legal tools to push back. We're fighting for transparency around accreditation. We're fighting back against regulatory rollbacks on gainful employment and borrower defense. We're fighting for debt relief for defrauded students. And we're fighting to make sure that student loan borrowers can avail themselves of state consumer protection laws. In the next 2 months, Secretary DeVos will finalize rules that will not only make it easier for for-profit schools to offer programs that are economically unjustified, but she will also make it harder for students who are cheated by their institutions to get compensation for their losses. And she will make it pretty clear that taxpayers are going to foot the bill for all of this. That's why we're here tonight. That's why we're working alongside so many other organizations to fight back. And that's why we need all of you to talk about these issues, and we need your help. There's so much to pay attention to these days, so many important issues, but I think if that movie teaches anything, it's that the crisis in student debt has lasting impacts on real people and everyday lives. So thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you for all of your support for NSLDN, and it's my pleasure to turn this over to the next portion of our evening and introduce what is really a fantastic, fantastic panel. I think I'm going to begin on the far side of the stage with our moderator for the evening, Jillian Berman. Jillian is a national reporter at Market Watch, where I think it's fair to say she's one of the few reporters out there who are dedicated full-time to covering issues of student debt. Prior to joining Market Watch, she was a reporter at the Huffington Post, and her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Bloomberg, and C-SPAN. Sitting next to Jillian is Professor Wade Henderson, who is a true champion of civil rights. He currently serves as a professor at the professor of law at the University of District of Columbia Law School, and for more than 20 years, he served as the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is a coalition of more than 200 national civil rights organizations. Sitting next to Professor Henderson is a woman who truly needs no introduction after the film. She has dedicated her career to public service. Congresswoman Maxine Waters served in the General Assembly of California from 1976 to 1990 and has represented South Central LA in the U.S. House of Representatives ever since. She's the ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee, a role I'm sure that she hopes will change in the coming year. And above all else, she is a leader and a champion for students, someone who has recognized that students in low-income and minority communities have been preyed upon by colleges charging enormously high rates of tuition while failing to provide a high-quality education. Sitting next to Congresswoman Waters is someone I'm proud to have worked for at the U.S. Department of Education, Secretary John King, where he was a champion for protecting students from unscrupulous actors across higher education. He was confirmed in 2016 as the Secretary after spending about a year as the Deputy Secretary of Education. And during Secretary King's tenure, he presided over some of the highest profile and most impactful enforcement actions and investigations into for-profit institutions of higher education, created and staffed a professionalized enforcement unit at Federal Student Aid, and published common sense rules to protect student loan borrowers who had been scammed and protect the financial interests of the federal government at the same time. And finally, an individual who I've met recently, Alex Chebanow, is the brains, the heart, and the soul of Fail State, the movie you just saw. From 2010 to 2013, he served as the media director of StudentMentor.org, a nonprofit that aids students from more than 2,000 colleges nationwide as they graduate and embark on their careers. And since then, he has worked tirelessly to create this film and bring a human voice to such an important issue. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jillian for the next portion of the presentation.
Okay, here we go. You can hear me. Okay, thank you. And let's do a quick round of applause for NSLDN for hosting us and for Alex for sharing the film. All right, and thank you all for being on this panel. Alex, let's start with you. Can you talk us through, sort of how you came up with the idea for this film and how you went about pursuing it?
So originally the film started as a student loan debt documentary. I was a recent college graduate, and my fellow producer, Julia Galassi, was also a fellow college graduate, and we were at lunch one day and was like, hey, who else to make a movie on student loan debt than people who have it and who just came out of it? And so we started making a film all about it, just like the draconian debt collection system. We did interviews with people like Rohit Chopra at the CFPB when he was ombudsman. We went headfirst into the story, and we taped 15 interviews when in June 2014, the federal government put a 21-day freeze on Corinthian College's federal financial aid disbursement, which anyone who's, as we saw in the film, basically led to its eventual demise. The company had become so insolvent, the company couldn't last 3 weeks without federal taxpayer dollars, basically. And so when that happened, I guess to tell the truth, I was a little naive about the for-profits. I'd known about them. I'd known like PBS Frontline had done a piece on them, but I was a little naive. But when Corinthian happened, I started digging into the story, and I started pulling as much information as I could. And it was one particular instance that really upset me, that really just like crystallized everything that was going wrong in the system. Was the GIBill.com, which we feature, which was this website masquerading as a government website that was just recruiting veterans under the pretense that they can only use their GI Bill benefits at for-profit colleges. When that happened, I just knew that this was a film that the story that had to be exposed. And from that point forward, the film that pivoted into that space, and it became a big expose on the for-profit colleges.
You spoke about the GIBill.com scheme. What were some of the other, sort of surprising things that you discovered when you started really digging into this?
I think the scope of it is really staggering. I think anyone who comes across this story has trouble comprehending just the total level of destruction that's happening to these students and for how long it's been going. I think that where I realized that to be was when we were filming, we were 10 or so interviews into this new for-profit college documentary that we were making, and I was like, okay, now's the time to go out and interview students. I was like, I don't come from a journalist background, but I was like, okay, how would I find students? And I just turned to Facebook. I turned to articles, and people would post on Facebook various articles, even Market Watch or BuzzFeed, and it'd be about some for-profit college news. But if you look in the comments, if you just like go and start scrolling through it, it was so easy to find students just talking. It's like, hey, I didn't attend ITD Tech. I went to this so-and-so for-profit college, and I know exactly what happened. This happened to me. And then at the time, I don't know if you can still do that today, but you could pay $1 on Facebook and message anyone without being friends. So I was just spending dollars to message people. And I guess like where it really like hit home for me was that, me not as a journalist background, just kind of like learning as I was going. In 2 weeks, I amassed 100 students. Just was able to start talking to them. Actually, the harder part was getting them to talk to me on the phone, was getting them to respond. And then it was even harder to eventually get them on camera because like this is like true human despair that we see on screen. It's embarrassment. It's this like hopelessness. And a lot of people just internalize that and they don't speak out.
And, we see some various faces, that have been victimized by this industry. But Wade, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, how what we see in the film and how the for-profit college industry plays into, the student debt problem overall as a racial justice issue? I know that's something you've written and spoken about.
No, it's a great question, Jillian. Let me say that when I headed the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is really the nation's largest civil and human rights coalition, we stood for the principle that in coalition there is strength. The nonprofit community, generally speaking, doesn't have the capacity to take on the institutional wealth that the for-profits bring to the struggle. And so without a coalition of organizations really working to advance a common interest, you won't succeed. The director of the education programs for the Leadership Conference, Liz King, is in the audience, and I want to commend her for the great work that she continues to do. What struck me in the work that we did was a recognition that the people who were most vulnerable had a common identity, and that was poverty. Regardless of race, poverty was the unifying force that brought all of us together, and there was a virtual caste system. You heard one of the experts in the film make reference to it. It was clearly a caste system. But what I want to point out, and then to go specifically, Jillian, to your question, is this. As much as we would like to isolate the dilemmas of higher education as really brought forth by this film, this is part of a broader problem and crisis in the education system in general. And while we would like to sort of separate this from the problems of K through 12, if we had a better education system with a floor of rights that every student would be entitled to receive, the chances of the outcome being what we saw in that film would be greatly diminished. It's poverty that puts us together. So this is the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And yet many of the problems that brought about the passage of the 14th Amendment in terms of fundamental inequality in society have not been resolved. I thought about that because this is also the 55th anniversary of George Wallace standing in the door in Montgomery County, the Montgomery city, blocking entrance of black students to the Tuskegee High School of the time, 1963, September, standing up saying, in effect, segregation now, segregation in the future, segregation forever. And that ties together in this fact, as much as things have changed, we still have a crisis of race and poverty in our system that won't change until we ultimately create a floor, a right to education that is really, I think, the key to addressing these larger questions. And I'll end it with this recognition. When you talked about the scope of the problem, what I realized is that students who are unable to discharge their debt in bankruptcy ultimately have no relief for the kind of problems that they face other than the work of this great organization. So as powerful as this film was, it was a testament to the kinds of things that the National Student Debt Relief Program ultimately provides, and I want to give them credit for that, and that's really part of the struggle.
I'll put this to you, but also to anyone else on the panel. When you, and this was mentioned in the film as well, when you hear, sort of for-profit colleges defend some of what we see in the film, they talk about, we're serving students who don't get served elsewhere. These are students who can't make it to a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 a.m. class, like what we think of traditionally. What do you all sort of say to that? And what can other sectors of higher education do to kind of deal with that problem?
Well, this is a living example of let the buyer beware. And the failure of the federal government to regulate effectively this area has created a virtual game preserve of students in poverty who have virtually no opportunity to advance into a middle-class lifestyle with, as they see it, without the beacon of these really predatory schools. The schools know it. They've set up an emotionally backed psychological profile of students, and they prey on them in the worst possible way. The fact that the federal government has chosen to turn its back really on students from the time that Congresswoman Waters came to Congress and raised these issues back in the early 90s, we have made a limited amount of progress. So I think what this really shows is that the failure to really properly regulate this area of work has created a system that is virtually unprotected, where exploitation runs rampant. And that's an ongoing and continuing problem.
Yeah, and talking regulation, Secretary King, I know, when you were serving at the Department of Education, I'm sure you heard a lot of stories like the ones featured in the film. Media was writing about them, and I'm sure I don't know for sure, but I imagine you felt some pressure to act. And when you were weighing decisions, how to address these kinds of problems, the steps you took with ITT, things like that, what were you thinking about? And can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think ultimately we felt a responsibility to act because the mission of the Education Department is to advance education excellence and equity, to try to protect students and taxpayers, and these institutions were taking advantage of both students and taxpayers, right? You've got billions of dollars of taxpayer money going to these schools. Taxpayers rightly expect a return on that investment. You have students investing their money, their time. They rightly expect a return on investment. And what's clear is that the schools weren't delivering that. And what we saw in the case of ITT was thousands of students being taken advantage of. And the question for the department as we kind of ratcheted up enforcement efforts was at some point, clearly students would be better off if ITT wasn't continuing to take advantage of them. And there's always the concern that students are going to feel disrupted in their education, and we tried as much as we could to help them get to community colleges, to other institutions that were doing a better job serving students. But at the end of the day, as you saw in the film, the students weren't benefiting from their experience at ITT. They were just being taken advantage of. I think for me, what's so painful about the movie, for me, and I know for many in this room, is I think by the end of the Obama administration, we were making tremendous progress on these issues. We set up a bar defense unit that was getting people their relief. We stood up an enforcement unit that was actively working to take action against these schools that were taking advantage of students. We had the gainful employment rules, which were starting to work, and programs were closing that were taking advantage of students. We had a bar defense rule in place that was going to allow us to more efficiently get students the relief they're entitled to. All of that now is being rolled back and undone. I think about the Congresswoman having spent 30 plus years at this, watching the country go through this cycle once again, where there's some progress towards a better oversight infrastructure, and then it is dismantled because of political folks who are choosing the interests of executives and shareholders over the interests of students and taxpayers.
And Congresswoman Waters, I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. As we saw in the film, you've been beating the drum on this issue for years, but we see a lot of the lobbying muscle coming from for-profit colleges. How has their approach changed over the years? What has the ebb and flow been like in terms of the relationship of the lobbying industry to you and your colleagues?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important for me to say that this documentary that I just witnessed most of, and this panel, and all of the young people and those who worked in the Department of Education, perhaps are creating the best, most viable opportunity that I've witnessed all of these years to start to get at this problem. I am just so very pleased about this documentary, and sitting here watching it, I even learned some things I didn't know about what was going on. Let me just go back for a number of years and tell you about what was happening in poor communities as it relates to these for-profit colleges. When I was in the California State Legislature, I decided at one point to focus most of my attention on poverty and the young people who were literally languishing in public housing projects, and to try and put together job training programs. And so I went into all of the public housing projects in South Los Angeles, and I created a program. And it was literally a program that I and some of the people who worked for me designed to, first of all, identify these young people who were languishing. You could see them hanging out daily, even though many of them didn't live in public housing. They had relatives there, they had friends there, and we thought, well, let's see what we can do to create a job training program. And at that time, they had something in the cities called Private Industry Council, et cetera, that was supposed to be doing this kind of work. And so we began to organize, and we created these programs, and we literally went door to door and recruited young people to come to classrooms that we had set up to talk about their education and to talk about job opportunities. And we located those who were supposed to be responsible for connecting people with jobs. But what did we see? What we saw was a lot of young people who had already been ripped off and who had tried to gain a career opportunity, to obtain a college, who had been confronted or recruited by these recruiters coming from these colleges, and who told us stories about what was going on. And then I had the really unfortunate experience of meeting and understanding what was going on with a so-called minister in the community who had learned about how these students could get loans and how he could participate in helping them to apply for these loans and set up a phony school operation himself. And literally, in those days, and I don't know what's happening now, they could apply, they could give the address of this minister who would receive all of this money and would kick back money to students to keep them from coming to school or to doing anything. And so it was absolutely appalling. I got together with legal aid, and I must give credit to a woman whose name you may have heard before, Elena Eccles, in Los Angeles, who became an expert at dealing with these rip-off schools. And so we started trying to do constituent work and to help young people who had gone through the process, who now were responsible for big debt that they could not afford, and to try and get some justice for them. But it was overwhelming. There were so many of them that had, found themselves in this situation. The one thing that I think really did trigger me was the way that some of the young people had so much hope, some who had not been ripped off yet. But I remember a group of young people who showed up in public housing with little green jackets on and what looked like little containers that would carry kind of medical equipment. And they were so proud that they had signed up for, education and career opportunities. And they had their little boxes, and they had their uniforms, and many of them were almost illiterate. And I was trying to figure out how did they think they were going to be able to gain this opportunity, this career opportunity, when they really needed basic education. But of course, the recruiters were looking for these very kind of people, looking for people who wanted to do better, who wanted an opportunity, didn't understand how systems work at all, didn't know the difference, and many still don't know the difference between a for-profit school or university and a community college. And at one time, when we were working very hard to assist getting rid of Corinthian, I thought one of the ways we could help students was to, particularly for those who were now victims of Corinthian closing down, was wouldn't it be nice if we could just transition them into community colleges? But we couldn't develop the systems by which to do that. And so all I can say is this. This is probably one of the biggest rip-offs and scandals in government of all times. The billions of dollars that are being lost consistently over the years that could be applied to community colleges and have free community college education for our students. This ripoff of billions of dollars, money that's being lost, that really could supply the funds for the community colleges in particular so that young people could have an opportunity. And lastly, in operating in South Los Angeles, in public housing, and getting to know a lot of the young people, many of them who at night were involved in gangs, but we built their trust and they were coming to us in the daytime to try and get an education or to get a career opportunity. And I'll never forget, more than one would pull me aside and say, "Ms. Waters, can you help me? I can't read." They were illiterate, and they were being taken advantage of. So this has been work that I've been doing for years. I created legislation that was literally undone. And some of the people who have been involved in assisting these for-profit schools and universities are people who are considered good legislators, people who are considered public policy people who care about these kinds of issues. Even in the state of California with Governor Brown and so much good that he's done recently in getting more money for education, he's responsible for making sure that the for-profit universities continue to be able to operate. And it is disheartening, it is disgusting, but I guess sitting here this evening, I am thrilled that I see these young people, and particularly those who have been in the Department of Education, who are saying we must pay attention. And even though in some instances we've made a little progress, whether we're talking about Corinthian or ITT or DeVry or others, Betsy DeVos is dangerous. She has come with an agenda. And one of the agendas is to make sure that the for-profit schools and universities can thrive and that they can continue to do what they do and do it even better. It's all about the money. It's all about the profits. And we're in for a ride. And some people wonder why I fight so hard against this administration. It's all about these kinds of issues. The very people, many of them, who are responsible for voting for this administration are poor people who are getting ripped off by the very person and persons that they thought were going to help them have an opportunity to change their lives. And so I want to thank you so very much. You've renewed my faith in the possibility that we can do something about this.
So you mentioned, the current situation at the Department of Education, which I'm sure many in this room are well aware of. We see some of the rules talked about in the film being curtailed or, totally reversed. And I'm wondering if you all could just weigh in a little bit about if the proposed changes go through, what the higher education system might look like in 5 to 10 years. And Alex, if you want to start, yeah.
I think one of the most tragic things that's unfolding today in our higher education system is that we're losing our community colleges and we're losing our public colleges. I mean, this is a decades-long trend where states continue to pull back their funding from these institutions that have long been, the doors of opportunity for so many. I'm a community college graduate. And so it's to see states like Arizona, for example, reducing their state subsidies to certain community colleges in the Phoenix area to $0 is a really disturbing trend. And the target market of the for-profit college industry is generally the students who would have gone to a community college. And so to see us closing these doors, limiting the amount of seats at community colleges, making community colleges more expensive than ever before. I was in California at a community college during the Great Recession, and I remember my first day of college ever was walking into a government 101 class, and there was a line of people just wrapped around the entire classroom. And the name of the game was, if you had a seat at the end of the class, you were in the class. And if not, sorry, you have to move on. This happened over and over and over again. And like to a lot of people, this is their only chance. And I think I'll just keep my thing brief, but where I think I see higher education going in the next 10 years, and it's a sad trend, is that these open access institutions are going to start closing their doors because there's nothing happening at the federal level that's going to change this. These trends, states continue to pull back. In recent years, with the economy doing so well, some states have been like maintaining their state investment in their publics. But when the next recession happens, we're going to see 4, 5, 6 steps backwards. And the recession after that, maybe it's 0. So Dr. Alexander from LSU in the film really quantified it. He put it in the perfect words. Like there's kids in 1st and 2nd grade today who might not have a public college when they become 18, 19. And so that's where I kind of see the tragedy unfolding in higher education.
I'm going to paint a more optimistic picture. Look, at the end of the day, I think because of the leadership of folks like Congressman Waters, because of the activism of folks like Wade, because of the folks in this room, we can make it different. I don't think it has to turn out that way. We've got governors and legislators around the country who are campaigning on the idea of a significant new investment in public higher ed. And we saw California just make a down payment on that. That's very encouraging. There's an opportunity for states to step up where the federal government is failing in its responsibility. States can regulate these institutions. States can step in to create their own gainful employment rule and to close down programs that are doing the wrong thing. And then we have litigation. I mean, I think the work that Aaron is doing, the work that you've heard about tonight, is part of the solution. We've got to use the tool of the courts to try to prevent the federal government from abandoning its responsibility. Finally, elections have consequences, and we have to elect folks at every level, from state government to Congress to a president, who cares about students and who believes in quality education. If we do those things, which is up to us in this room, then we can have a different future.
Well, it's all about leadership. And when you have leadership, whether it's in state government or federal government, at the very top, who does not support the idea that you should have affordable education and that these private colleges and universities should not be in a position where they can literally create this kind of debt and basically change people's lives forever. We have people who are in debt, who have been in debt for years, and because of this debt, they can't have access to other things like housing, public housing, etc. And so when you're burdened with debt, you don't have a decent job because you've gone to a private university or college that held out that they could help you to earn more money, to get a career, and it has not happened. And so you're working at the lowest pay level at, $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour or what have you, and you can't get housing. It's devastating. And you saw in this documentary what was happening, and it is absolutely true that we have young people who are trying so hard, who are living in cars, who don't have the nutrition and the food that they need in order to be able to operate on a daily basis. Then you've got to understand that unless we can get the kind of people elected to office who care about these issues, and not people who care about profits, and they're surrounded with those who care about profits, and this is what they work at. How can we get more money out of this situation? How can we charge more? How could we dupe people into signing on the bottom line, et cetera? Unless we change the leadership, I'm not going to be as optimistic. We've got to change the leadership. Why should Betsy DeVos Why should she be the head of education in this country? I tell a little bit of joke when I go out and I talk with people about this administration and about the cabinet, and I say she has never seen the inside of a classroom. She has never served on the PTA. She's never been on an education board in a city, etc. What I try to do is paint a picture of someone who's now in a position who's never really demonstrated their care and concern about education and the least of these and how we're going to get them educated. Then why is she there? And who is she there for? And why was she appointed? And why is he president? Enough said.
I was actually waiting for that last line. Look, I don't know. I think this is one of those instances where crisis begets opportunity. At least I hope so. I think the film clearly demonstrated the existence of a crisis in higher education, but as I said, the crisis is much deeper than that. I love the subtitle of the film, which is Subprime Goes to College. I think that's terrific because it captures very succinctly the kind of exploitation that we saw in the housing and mortgage industry now applied to higher education. And people can relate to that. When I talk about crisis begetting opportunity, though, I'm really talking about the individuals who are themselves directly affected by the level of exploitation that we've seen. I now work with the Center for Responsible Lending. I'm a senior fellow there, and I meet a number of young millennials who are carrying a level of student-related debt, some from for-profit schools, some from private schools, and they are unable to buy homes. These are people who are taking out loans to subsidize their families because their families have encountered hard times. These are complicated issues, but these are young people that are saying, look, why do I have to shoulder this burden? Student loan debt is the only debt that is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. How did that happen? And why is it that there has been no real serious conversation about this question? And it's younger people, millennials, who are driving that discussion. My hope is that their expectation that government will provide a better level of protection than it has thus far will help to drive the kind of change we're talking about. Secondly, employers are now surveying the prospect of drawing workers from public schools where students are overwhelmingly now majority students of color. In many instances, the schools are not providing the level and foundation of training necessary to produce a competent workforce through no fault of their own. These are bright students who in the past have been deemed morally deficient in some way because they have not completed schools that have not provided them with adequate training, but that attitude is changing. When I look at teachers raising hell in places like West Virginia and Kentucky and Oklahoma, shining attention on the fact that these state legislators have robbed schools to subsidize all manner of other businesses in the states, and that people are saying no longer will we accept that. That is producing a level of change. In fact, you are now seeing in gubernatorial races all over the country people talking about free tuition for community colleges, just as Tennessee was proposed here, and you're seeing it adopted in places where Republican governors themselves, who previously had opposed that, are now embracing it. Larry Hogan in Maryland is now talking about free tuition for students there to respond to the pressure that he's gotten from a progressive Democrat running against him. My point in all of this is that this is a time of great change. Younger people are driving that change, a sense of reality that the future that they will inherit will not adequately address their needs, and employers are saying, look, we can't import enough workforce talent the administration has now clamped down, as you know, on extending visas to workers from abroad, which has forced businesses, fortunately, to take a closer look at the workforce we're producing in this country, and they're finding it, unfortunately, ill-prepared for the jobs that they have now and in the future. So all those forces are coming together with organizations like this that are sponsoring the event that I hope will help to produce a level of change that, based on this new leadership, that invariably is going to happen over the next decade, will help to respond to this problem. So I'm actually a little more optimistic, not quite as pessimistic as some, but I get it.
You asked a question about lobbying, and you saw in the documentary that lobbying plays a big role. They have lots of money, and they spend that money. And in California, they had something that they would do for legislators. In addition to supplying them with contributions, they would offer you 5 scholarships for anybody in your community that you want to give them to. And many of the legislators love the idea of getting scholarships that they could go out and brag about and tell people that they're given to someone in the community. So they have all kind of tricks, and they spend an awful lot of money lobbying. And I have to say that what you saw in this documentary, and Arnie Duncan, I think, was shocked by the fact that he saw so many members of the Black Caucus who had been caught up in this web of activity where they allowed these for-profit institutions to basically gain access to them so that they could vote the right way. And one of the biggest fights that I had coming into the Congress of the United States was trying to make sure that we did not allow these institutions to be 100% funded. And that's when we did the 80-15, and I fought so hard, and now that's been changed to 90-10, and on and on and on. They won't stop unless we have legislators and leadership that are convinced that they need to pay more attention to support for real education, for substantive education, and for providing people the opportunity to have careers. And as you just said, the industries really are going to need educated people and people who are trained in order to carry out the jobs and the positions that are going to be needed for this economy and for the future. And if we allow these for-profit institutions to continue to pretend to educate when they're not educating and they're taken advantage of, we're going to lose opportunities to really get people prepared for the jobs of the future.
I think something I tried to show in this film, and I hope it was clear, is that this issue is both Republican and Democrat. There's very key trends here, or lines that both sides can come to the table and agree on. Congresswoman Waters, you worked with Marge Rokema to pass your regulations in 1992. I mean, back then, a lot of Republicans, Reagan Republicans, were against these trade school abuses. And then, as you saw with Newt Gingrich coming into office in '94, and then subsequently the subsequent decades, this issue became like a Democrat versus Republican issue. But it doesn't have to be that way. So I think there's ways to make these arguments, like the abuse of veterans, the abuse of taxpayer dollars. Both sides can come and solve the solution together. Actually, I think that's basically the end game here, is that our leadership on both sides needs to come together and realize that, hey, this isn't a capitalistic solution in higher education. This is just the worst of both worlds. Worst of liberals pushing for access for all, and the worst of conservatives pushing for free market principles in an education system.
And I think we're running out of time, but before we go, we've talked a lot about the future, and Secretary King, I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on the past. What do you think, is the Obama administration's legacy with this stuff? As we've discussed, things are very different now. Was there more you could have done to prevent what's happening currently?
Well, look, I think all of us who are at the department would say we wish we could have done more faster, right? I think by the end of the administration, we were putting in place an infrastructure that I think was much stronger. You think about ACICS, the accreditor that was responsible for Corinthian and ITT up until the moment they closed. We tried to shut down that accreditor. Betsy's trying to bring that accreditor back. I think at the end of the day, we felt like we were positioned to hand off to a next administration an infrastructure that would protect students. And unfortunately, the next administration has chosen to dismantle all of that. It is a lesson, I think, in the importance of congressional politics alongside executive branch politics. You need to be in a position where it's not just reliant on executive action, but where you have Congress in a position to protect those rules. It's a good thing we have congressional elections every 2 years.
I would just make two quick observations. First of all, I think the film makes this point quite effectively. There is so much money invested and involved in for-profit schools that naive assumptions about how you mobilize public opinion and activity are not going to address this problem at the end of the day. There's too much money involved, guys. When Wall Street decided to invest its resources in creating a profit incentive for these schools, it did so with a level of sophistication that is unlikely to be dismantled without some more strategic government involvement, as was being done at the end of the Obama administration and is now being overturned. Secondly, single issue focus, that is focusing on higher education or for-profit schools, is in a sense a deceptive sort of approach, because it's not the exclusive problem. Let me remind everyone that this session is being held against the backdrop of a debate over the future of the Supreme Court that I can assure you will decide these issues in a variety of ways. This question about who is the next justice on the court will have potentially significant impact on how these issues are resolved in the sphere of public policy. So focusing only on higher education, not looking at the totality of the system, not recognizing that there is a need to bring in different elements of the body politic to create a stronger level of coalition engagement, I think is a mistake. And I think that becomes part of our broader effort to build a people's movement that is appreciative of the issues that are at stake and that can help focus attention on those problems, just as I think the film has done in a really positive way.
And I think that's all the time we have, so thank you all for participating.
Thank you all for coming out, and just join me in giving another round of applause to this panel. Thank you so much. For those of you who are interested in volunteering or donating, we'll have a table on the way out. I know it's getting late, so I'll let everyone run. And I just want to close by thanking them once again, and also thanking John, not just for all his leadership as secretary, but as one of the people probably most responsible for our organization existing today. Thank you again.